Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Schuster, Executive Director of BlackRock Forest, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for attending our 2021 Biodiversity Benefit. BlackRock Forest's mission is to advance scientific understanding of the natural world through research, education, and conservation. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we can't gather indoors this year to hear a luminary speaker as we've done in the past. So this year, our benefit is a hybrid event with 2 in-person bio blitzes we completed in BlackRock Forest and Central Park over the past weeks, and culminating in this online event this evening. I hope you all enjoyed our opening photo montage featuring pictures of activities in BlackRock Forest, including many of you in attendance. You are all part of what makes BlackRock Forest work. I would like to thank our leadership and the organizers of this event, especially our benefit chairs, David and Jeanette Redden, and Hume and Anaya Steyer, our benefit committee, and our development committee, who are wonderfully helpful in guiding the success of this event. Also, Brienne Cleodakis and our incredibly hardworking staff, who worked tirelessly to pull all the pieces of this event together. I'd also like to express gratitude to our panel of biodiversity experts who you'll be hearing from shortly. And thanks to the many of you who have sponsored this event. I hope that you are enjoying your BlackRock Forest gift boxes, and that you'll enjoy the breakout sessions that we're offering at the end of the event. Our main theme this evening is biological diversity and the many ways it enriches our lives and is critical for the health of our planet. It should concern us all that the Earth's biological diversity is under threat due to some human activities. But with understanding can come solutions for sustaining our natural life support system. BlackRock Forest is an important sentinel ecosystem for advancing that understanding. But even New York City is wonderfully bio-rich, and we'll devote a bit of the program to comparing the two. Our other theme is citizen science, and how each of us can play a contributing role using cool apps like iNaturalist, for example, to expand our understanding of the world's richness and to contribute to local, regional, and even global data sets. We'll first have an introduction of our expert biodiversity panel by BlackRock Forest President Hilary Callahan. Then, after the expert discussion, we'll present the results of our BlackRock Forest and Central Park bio blitzes, and then open the floor to a live question and answer session where you all can pose questions to our experts using an embedded chat function. Then we will hear from our co-chairs and finish with a brief video from our bio blitz, followed by breakout rooms for those who wish to join them. While no contribution is required to attend this evening's event, we are most grateful to all who generously contributed and directly supported our work, keeping BlackRock Forest open for people from all walks of life to enjoy, even through the pandemic, accomplishing and supporting environmental research to advance our understanding of nature, facilitating some 15,000 student visits each year from our 20 academic member institutions, and contributing significantly to the conservation of our Highlands region. In case any of you would like to contribute during the course of this event, there is a QR code that you can scan at the top of the screen, or you can click the link that will appear at the bottom of the screen to take you to our website donation page. Now it's my honor to introduce my friend and colleague and our president, a botanical biodiversity expert herself, Barnard College's Ann Whitney Olin Professor of Biological Sciences and Biology Department Chair, Dr. Hilary Callahan.
Hello, thank you for joining tonight's biodiversity panel discussion, the culmination of the 2021 BlackRock Forest Benefit. My name is Hilary Callahan. I'm a professor and chair of biology at Barnard College. And I also have the privilege, now for the 3rd year, to serve as BlackRock Forest president to the board. I'm excited about tonight's biodiversity theme because I've long been passionate about biodiversity conservation and enthralled by all kinds of organisms, from ants to acorns, blue jays to blueberries. As a young adult, the only thing more thrilling than earning my PhD in botany were the breadth requirements associated with the degree. I opted to study, you guessed it, biodiversity. My university level courses in entomology and ornithology are even more memorable than my many plant science courses. That's also why I'm so excited about tonight's panel discussion format. We don't have to choose one narrow specialty. We can embrace and celebrate all kinds of biodiversity and biodiversity's many dimensions. We're joined tonight by Clara Holmes from New York City Parks, an expert on plants, Scott Silver from Audubon's Constitution Marsh to discuss birds, and Jessica Ware, a curator of entomology from the American Museum of Natural History, who will share her expertise on insects. The facilitator is my wonderful colleague, Shahid Naeem from Columbia University. He always insists that he's a biodiversity generalist. He doesn't specialize on one narrow group. And one thing I agree with him about: all organisms are important and they're all awesome and fascinating. I hope we can all enjoy together learning more about biodiversity from these congenial experts. Thanks for coming.
I'd like to start by thanking the people who put this together and also our speakers ahead of time for having the opportunity to share with all of you. And thanks to all the participants for coming online. Black Rock Forest is the focus of this event. I actually live not too far from Black Rock Forest, and biodiversity is this year's theme. They've had different themes over the years. And I was thinking, you know, especially now where we have a new administration coming in, which is planning to increase funding in environmental research, there's a lot of competition for those funds. Right now, we have things like climate change, we have pollution, we have emerging diseases such as the pandemic we find ourselves in, although it seems thankfully to be winding down. We have invasive species and we have biodiversity loss. And, you know, I thought it'd be really interesting to hear from you folks. And I thought I'm going in the order on my screen here, to maybe start with Carla again, as to why you think that of all the things that are going on, that we might really pay extra attention to biodiversity, how your work sort of fits into that, and what sort of role does Black Rock Forest play in this importance of biodiversity?
Well, we know plants are primary producers, right? So they sort of bring the energy from the sun and turn it into the food for other organisms. So in some senses, they are the center of the food web. And we also know that plant species richness, as that increases, the richness of other organisms increase. So I suppose my argument would be as to why plants should be at the center of biodiversity here is they're sort of the basis, right? The more plant species you have, the more insects that are going to come in, and the more insects you have in the forest, the more birds and mammals you might see in that forest. So in that sense, they're an important level of biodiversity. As a scientist with New York City Parks, I've certainly noticed that in places where we have some of our really unique, locally sensitive or state rare plant species, they all sort of persist in the same area. So they're growing together as a community within our areas. For example, we have an oak opening in a meadow in Pelham Bay Park that has between 5 and 8 any given year state listed species within about 2 acres. And it's just a really rich meadow. It has many more species that are locally sensitive, and they're all there in that small area. And I think that as we work to preserve plant species richness and particularly native species diversity, we're not only increasing the likelihood of diversity of other organisms, but we're also likely to need less management in that area. Of course, New York City is such an urban environment, and all of our forests require some degree of management at this point. And the more plant species and other organism species richness that we have, the more biodiversity that we have in these areas, the less inputs are required for management. And you know, management is an important component of our work with New York City Parks, but it also provides the opportunity for negative impacts to the forest. So the less management we actually have to do, the better. And I see that, you know, in places where we have high species diversity, there's less management required. And as for Black Rock Forest, I mean, there are the most recent sort of surveys of Black Rock Forest and New York City show that out of the diversity that is there in Black Rock Forest, you have about 80% of the diversity is native plant species. And in New York City, roughly 65% of the diversity of plant species is native. So you have, to some extent, a more intact forest ecosystem in terms of native plant species diversity, which is a great thing to see, and might implicate there's a little less management and also a little more diversity in other organisms.
That's amazing. I didn't actually realize that the native diversity was that high. That's pretty startling at Black Rock Forest. Just because when you walk around, a lot of the times what catches your eye is the invasive species along the roadside. But then if you wander away, I guess you start to see the native species. Going in my screen again. How about you, Scott? How would you argue for focusing on biodiversity?
Well, actually, as far as the value of biodiversity, I see it as there's sort of a wider value to it, a philosophical justification, I would say. And this sort of goes back to some of my comments earlier, where every species, every even subspecies is a manifestation of life and has an entire suite of characteristics in which to provide for itself and live through its life cycle. And I think there's an intrinsic value to that that has nothing to do with people, but is nonetheless a testament to the wonder of life and the power of speciation, and that's biodiversity in itself. I think on a more selfish level, there's plenty of reasons to try to be concerned with biodiversity and to try to maintain high levels of biodiversity. From a practical standpoint, the main reason is that we don't know what we don't know about the role of species in ecosystems in our own life. And I think Aldo Leopold is often paraphrased as saying, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to save all the parts. Well, we're certainly tinkering in the Anthropocene, and it seems foolhardy to not be concerned about what parts we're saving and we're getting rid of. So from an intrinsic value, biodiversity is, to me, extremely important. And from a practical standpoint, the value of biodiversity to humanity is unknown. There's, all of us, I'm sure, have come across instances where very specific characteristics of organisms, whether plants or birds or mammals, serve a unique function in an ecosystem. Just one quick example, I used to study howler monkeys in Central America that relied on fruit to get them through the year, most of the year. There was about a 3-month span in the forest where there was no fruit in this particular study site that I had. And the howler monkeys, all the howler monkeys relied on one specific tree species that had very high levels of sugar in the leaves. At the time when I first started observing this, I noticed they were all eating the same tree, the leaves from the tree, and I didn't know why. Normally you get your sugar from fruit, but if there's no fruit available, you have to look for something else. And just the presence of this one particular species that up until we observed it, nobody knew was important to this particular population of monkeys became extremely important, and it became extremely obvious. And how many instances of that exist out there, whether we're talking about characteristics that lead to new medications or that help ecosystems function effectively or lead to more healthy outcomes for ecosystem services, we don't know at this point. So it seems foolhardy to me to not be concerned with saving all the parts.
All right. It's interesting because you talked about both the utilitarian as well as the sort of the intrinsic or cultural value of biological diversity. So Jessica, this must become a sort of tension in your work as well when you're trying to talk about the value of biodiversity, because there are a lot of people who don't like insects, right? They don't like things that bite and they think they're scary. How do you try to talk about the value of diversity with the group that you're working on?
It is true. I mean, it's hard to convince people to save maggots. Save the maggots. Don't let a single mosquito species go. That is a bit of a challenge. But certainly, I mean, I do try and talk about how insects, they have about 400 million years of evolution that we're looking at. This is the product of 400 million years of evolution. People love the idea of time travel, and kind of looking at insects is a great way to do that. To kind of see what's happened, since the Carboniferous period, when there were large griffin flies, that were flying around that look sort of like dragonflies, but that are not dragonflies. And so that can be a good angle, I think, to try and get people interested in the diversity that we're seeing now. People love fossils. Why not? Why would you be more interested in a dinosaur that was already extinct than something that's actually exists today? But then also, I mean, from a very practical standpoint for insects, they are such an important part of maintaining human life. A lot of the nutrition that we actually derive from the foods that we eat requires insects to kind of make those plants. And so we can think from a very practical standpoint, do we want to survive? That's a very easy question for people viscerally. The answer is yes, right? And insects are a really big part of that. And then when you think about all of the other aspects that happen in your day-to-day life, they really are shaped by insects. The reason why we don't trip over, the carcasses of our loved ones or every tree that's ever fallen down is thanks to insects doing decomposition. So you can really talk to people about these different kind of almost invisible or behind the scenes jobs that insects are doing that kind of allow us to thrive in our own species. And then certainly, for Black Rock Forest and for this part of the United States, we actually have really high diversity. So for dragonflies alone, I think there's over 160 species in this area. There's 188 in New Jersey alone. And that's pretty high compared to some other states. So people often tend to think of the tri-state area perhaps as being devoid of interesting taxa, but we actually have some pretty remarkable taxa that are unique and kind of fascinating. And like I said, have these long evolutionary histories. So I think that you can appeal to people, to the sense of wonder that there is so much diversity packed into even just these kind of small forest areas, or small compared to the entire size of the United States, I suppose.
Cool. Yeah. So it's interesting because my students have worked on this question of biological diversity. They're kind of forced to because I'm the professor, but for some 30 years or more. And our latest paper is actually on the importance of fish diversity in Peruvian diets, and how the loss of that diversity is actually going to lower the nutritional quality of the diets that the people, because the fish, wild-caught fish, is the major protein source for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then Black Rock Forest, which is just for me about 10 minutes away when I'm out here, has been a great place for me to do research locally rather than traipsing around the world. I love traipsing around the world, but it's so nice to just go to Black Rock Forest. I'm going to have to look for all those species of dragonflies. I'm not sure I can tell them apart and pay more attention to the native species. But in the slide that I provided, I showed it. It's complicated because it has a couple of graphs on it. People say don't show graphs, but I think that people who are attending a Black Rock biodiversity benefit are probably smarter than your average audience participants. I thought a couple of graphs would be good to show. And basically what it shows is that we have very high levels of deer at Black Rock, as we do throughout the tri-state area. And what this graph shows is that where you don't have deer, and at Black Rock Forest, they actually built fences to keep the deer out. And where you do have deer, and what you see in the graphs is that they're very different colored arrows. If you squint at it, you can see that the presence of deer is altering the vegetation. And the absence of deer leads to a very different kind of vegetation. It makes us think about these things you've been talking about. So what Carla was saying about the primary productivity or the other species that live on those plants, every plant's going to be host to many other species, is going to be affected by this deer herbivory. And it sort of links back to Scott's first exposure to biodiversity, seeing the deer at the pond, and asking, well, what is their function? What is their role? And if their numbers are really large because we don't have wolves or we don't manage the deer populations very well, how does that feed back to the plants and the insects? I keep thinking, what if we had a microbial person in this panel here to talk about how many species of microbes that are there in the soil, on the plants and the animals and so forth, we would see an even richer prospect here. I'm interested in that. I'm not sure about the time, but I thought I'd just ask, maybe have a discussion about this. I mean, Carla, you said you started out as an artist, and I had an interest in the medical profession, I think, which was pushed by my parents, we have alternative interests. And yet, somehow, do you feel that those feed into our research? So, Scott, you talked about the cultural, the sort of intrinsic value of biodiversity. Does that shape your research, or do you have to keep the cultural and the aesthetic, the religious? Do you have to keep that separate so you can be rigorously scientific? Or do you feel that actually these alternative views of life actually enhance and enrich your research? Let me start with you, Jessica, since you study so many species. Do you feel that your sort of personal sense of the aesthetic and fondness for it actually enriches your science, or is it something you have to keep separate?
I definitely think that I just personally, for my own satisfaction of my job, I do enjoy being able to spend time doing biological illustration, or I really love history. If I was going to do another career, I probably would have tried to be an historian. But reading about, the history of people who studied insects and the history of the way that they documented, there's a big cicada emergence happening right now. For example, periodic cicadas are out, but people have had the same sense of wonder that they're having right now about this big brood emergence. For as long as there have been people in the Eastern United States. So incorporating, our understanding of indigenous knowledge, our understanding of art, our understanding of music, incorporating all of that into science, I think actually only just makes the questions that we're posing richer and maybe actually more broadly applicable and impactful, I find. So I would definitely say keep them all together, mix it together.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because actually I feel that the periodic cicadas are in the news almost every day. So
Yeah.
you don't usually have insects, there in the news. But Carla, how about you? I mean, do you still do art? Does art influence your science?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I still do some now and then, but I think most importantly, I was trained. My father was an artist and an architect, so I got that at a very early age, and I think it trained my eye in a way that helps me see the plant communities or pollinators and the like. They stand out quite a bit more. My eye can catch something that is different in the forest that other people may miss. So I certainly think that plays a role in my work. I also think, a lot of what I do is much more about practical management and maintaining plant communities within New York City than simply research. And I think, the idea of the culture around a certain area certainly plays a role in that aspect of management. We can't manage the forests and the wetlands or the parks and preserves in New York City just from the perspective of the environment, right? We have to look at it within the context of the specific community that surrounds it and what their interests are in having an open space and what their needs are for that area. So I certainly think that culture in general plays a large role in the work that I do.
So Scott, so you just heard this conversation here about the role or the influence of the sort of, I guess in ecosystem services, we'd call those the cultural values or cultural services. Now, I've been working with ecosystem services like you, and I find that people talk about provisioning services, and they talk about, regulating services like regulating the climate or regulating diseases or pollination. And then they always seem to leave cultural services out because it's a hard thing to measure. As someone who's interested in ecosystem services, what do you do with cultural services? Do you leave them out, or do you try to figure out how to include them in our deliberations?
I think that you really have to include them in deliberations. There are. I think that a lot of times when we're talking about the value of biodiversity or ecosystem services, it depends on the audience that I'm trying to communicate with. With my role as an educator, I think certain things. I almost when you ask me which of these two which of these two worldviews, predominates. I would say that it's a single worldview, but when I'm communicating with others, I might emphasize one or the other. Myself personally, I think intrinsic value is more than enough motivation in trying to make decisions about eco management and land use issues. I think when trying to persuade others, that may not be adequate, and we rely more on the other.
Let me try this out on you. I had an argument a long time ago at a conference with Joan Roughgarden. She's a faculty at Stanford, and we were talking about the utilitarian value of biodiversity for, say, pollination and for biogeochemical processes like production, nutrient cycling, oxygen production, and so forth. And she just stopped us all and she said, "That's so cold, no one will care. You have to talk about the cultural values." And I was somewhat surprised because I said, but everybody loves a blue sky. And a blue sky is a beautiful thing, but it is a product of biogeochemistry. And she said, "You don't get it, do you?" So what do you think about that sort of exchange? Because I get the sense that all of us sort of feel that underpinning a lot of the wonder of the world is, in fact, the scientific mechanisms, but others see them as separate. Any thoughts on that, any of you?
I think that amongst ourselves and the audience that we have here, it is more difficult to see a sort of a cold, calculated argument winning the day when it comes to making decisions about that have implications for biodiversity and conservation. I think in the larger world, I'm continually surprised by how important, what little importance some of these intrinsic values that I was talking about earlier seem to
Yeah.
have.
Well, there's a paper, I was one of the co-authors a long time ago, and we said that the value of the world's biodiversity and ecosystems was I think it was $39 trillion. And to this day, I still get guff from people for being a co-author. Fortunately, it's sort of disappearing. But I think one of the faults, and rightly so, was they said we did a bad job of the intrinsic value of nature in that, and that's the toughest thing. How can you put a price on nature? Our argument was that a lot of times when it comes to the administration, whether it's the Biden-Harris or whether it's the Trump administration, is that dollars tend to resonate with policymakers. And so for all of us as scientists, when we get asked to tell people about our science and then to say, how do we compete with the sort of financial issues, we wind up getting dragged into that conversation. Even though I think we can see it, it's hard sometimes to articulate it. So I like Black Rock Forest because it's a place where people can actually go and see it firsthand, right? It might be a little hard in Manhattan, but you can get to Black Rock in about an hour, and actually see all of what you've been talking about firsthand. So I think we're going to go to the question and answer period now, thanks all for your sharing your thoughts with each other and with the audience about the importance of biodiversity and the role our research and also Black Rock Forest plays in that. So let's see. I think we've got some pretty terrific questions coming in. I think Bill is going to take over now.
Okay, thank you, Shahid, and also Clara and Jessica and Scott for your biodiversity insights and anecdotes. And also thanks again to our supporters. Some of you have used the QR code at the top of the screen or the link at the bottom to contribute to our benefits. So thank you very much again. We'll get to your questions for the panel in just a minute, but I'd like to first share with everyone the results from our 2 bio blitzes the 2 previous Saturdays. We wanted to involve some of our friends and supporters, many of whom are attending this evening, in an attempt to catalog some of our biodiversity, focusing mainly on plants and birds to keep the scope of the blitz reasonable, and use the events to contribute to a wonderful and growing local and global database. We had about 75 people participate in all, and 55 of them used the iNaturalist app on their phones to officially record their observations. This gives us a snapshot of organisms present at a particular time and place. But the iNaturalist database is growing rapidly and now contains over 50 million observations. If observations are accompanied by photos and/or sound files sufficient to definitely identify a species, And if the identification is then confirmed by others, it becomes a research-grade observation. And there are now hundreds of scientific papers that have incorporated research-grade observations from the iNaturalist database. And we are aiming to build Black Rock Forest's iNaturalist database into a powerful tool for studying our biodiversity. So when you contribute in this way through iNaturalist, you are really contributing to science. Our first slide then is a table highlighting the basic summary results of our 2 volunteer BioBlitz efforts. I'd like to thank, by the way, the experts and staff who helped attendees of both these events, particularly Terry-Ann Mayenza-Gamelch, Bob Slechta, and Hillary Callahan at the Black Rock Forest BioBlitz, and Clara Holmes, Emily Wolf, Francesco Filiacci, and Hillary at our Central Park Blitz. This table was compiled last week, and some new data are still coming in, but the table summarizes the trends pretty well. At the top, you can see the amount of effort in terms of numbers of observers and area covered were greater in Black Rock Forest, 34 people actually recording on their phones in Black Rock Forest versus 20 in Central Park. And in Black Rock Forest, we walked roads and trails covering substantially more area than in Central Park. We had about 900 observations made in Black Rock Forest versus a little over 500 from Central Park. And yet, the numbers of species observed were not all that different. 264 species in Black Rock Forest and nearly 200 in Central Park, in a much smaller area around the lake and the ramble by 77th Street. The volunteers recorded 40 bird species in Black Rock Forest versus closer to 30 in Central Park. Now, certainly the bird fauna of both locations is much greater than this, but birds are very hard to photograph using a cell phone camera compared to plants, for example. 185 different species of plants were observed in Black Rock Forest compared to 150 in Central Park. The amount of these observations that have been confirmed and risen to research grade was about 20% in each case as of last week. And this proportion has increased over the past week as more experts have weighed in, and we've now confirmed that the results include some new plant species that were never before on the official list for Black Rock Forest. Very cool finding. Also, interestingly, some 85% of the observed species from Black Rock Forest were native species compared to 70% in that part of Central Park. I'll now show you on the next slide which species were the most commonly observed at each place. And interestingly, there's no overlap among the top 5. In Black Rock Forest, striped maple and Canada mayflower, both of which were in flower, were the most commonly observed species. And they were followed by witch hazel, Christmas fern, and garlic mustard on the next slide. In Central Park, American robin and mayapple were the most commonly observed, followed by red columbine, gray squirrel, and celandine poppy. And now to announce the prize winners for our most observations and species. Kathy Marzak and Gina Olson for the most observations, both over 100 each. And on the next slide, Yvette Rodriguez and Sherry Tom observed the most species, 45 and 36 species respectively. We will be sending Black Rock Forest prizes for winning to each of you in the mail. Thank you for your contributions. And so at this point, we'd like to bring in our expert panelists again, live, and open up the question and answer session. Any of you in the audience can ask a question to anyone on the panel or in general by typing it in on the chat feature. So now I'll pass it over to Shahid, who will moderate the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Bill, for showing us the incredibly interesting data collected by everybody. In fact, it raises some questions right off the bat, and maybe we'll start there. One of the things I think was surprising that 70% of the species in Central Park were native. And the question we have is, were they planted by the park? And we have someone here who might be able to address that. So Clara, does the mandate or the directions for management include focusing on native species, or do you have the public demanding things like marigolds and daffodils to make the park pretty?
I think it's a combination of both. Over the last 10 years or so, I'd say the interest in and the encouragement from the community to plant native has increased. The availability of native plants on the market has also slowly started to increase. So I think that is definitely a part of it. I think you do have some stragglers that are native that are seeding themselves in. So not everything that is native that's there was planted. Whitewood aster, for example, or white snake root are a couple of common plants that are found throughout the city that are native species that would easily find their way into Central Park. But yeah, I think by and large, the gardeners of the park are interested in increasing the native biodiversity and increasing the kinds of species that are found in Central Park that would interest the public when they come to visit.
Well, so it's interesting what Bill said about the fact that you can photograph a plant, which helps to get that observation up to, research grade observation, but not for birds. And what's interesting is that, when you looking at those data from the BioBlitz, it seems like although there was smaller area surveyed and fewer people doing it, there are nearly as many species that were observed in Central Park as in Black Rock Forest, although we know there's a difference in the number there. But I was wondering about the birds because, very few people probably with their cell phone were able to get their observations to a research grade. And so Scott, and especially, I know a lot of visitors go up to the marsh that you oversee. Do you feel that parks actually have greater diversity than wild areas or places like Black Rock Forest? I know that if I walk through Central Park, I certainly see a lot of species, whereas I could hike through Black Rock Forest and not see very many species on a long hike. What's your thought about that?
Well, I think that there's two things to consider. One is the breeding populations of birds that are found in the various habitats, and it may be that in smaller fragments of protected area or less widespread area, you have fewer species of breeding birds, but the role of places like Central Park when it comes to rest stops for migratory birds, it can't be underestimated. And that's also a very important leg in maintaining biodiversity, because without those stopover points, biodiversity of birds disappears in places far away from Central Park because they're unable to get there, because you're reducing their ability to migrate and survive.
Yeah, I was thinking that the time that people see most species is during the migration season, right? When all these birds are actually in the park, but just in a transient way. They're not stopping there to breed, for example. But you can see a lot of species when that's actually happening.
Right.
But then I was thinking that even more difficult, of course, is the insects, and we're going to leave out the microbes, because I imagine, and I wonder if there actually is, but what happens when you actually get to the invertebrates and people see them but don't know what they are? It's hard to even make an observation. Do you think that that poses a problem for iData, or is it a matter of catching up? Especially given that this area has so many species of dragonflies, which is something you know a fair amount about, Jessica. What do you think about why there are more species here of dragonflies, and what's the likelihood that's going to be picked up by citizen scientists?
Well, I mean, we certainly have a lot of habitat heterogeneity, and that has allowed, dragonflies and damselflies to really have a variety of different types of water sources, because they have to have fresh water for their nymphs to develop. And I think that certainly our ability to quickly snag a photo of a fast-flying dragonfly or damselfly, that definitely impacts the counts that we get in things like iNaturalist or what have you. They're very difficult to photograph, even by expert, dragonfly photographers. And even if you do get a good photo, it can sometimes be hard to identify it, just simply because the way that dragonflies are built, if you have the wings in focus, which usually is what you need for identification. The rest of the body may not be in focus and vice versa. So I think almost certainly people are probably underestimating the number of species that are in Central Park, maybe, or that certainly are in amongst the tri-state area. But certainly, I think we have a lot of habitat that's actually perfect for dragonflies. They're not as picky as some other insects, and so a small pool of water and some good flies to eat is really what they're looking for. And I think if more people spent time, observing these dragonflies, we actually might have a better perspective on their geographic range, kind of across the tri-state area.
When you said that, I was just thinking, what if I had a pet dragonfly? I'd have to go and get some tasty flies for them, which would feed them with another set of insects. We have a question from Hume Steyer, who's actually one of the co-chairs of the Black Rock Forest Board, but he asks a very interesting question, actually. I often start a talk on biodiversity by saying there's 8.7 million species. I can explain how we get that number and why I like that number, but even so, that's a lot of species, and they're more than birds and plants and charismatic insects like dragonflies and butterflies. What about priapulids, the vestiminifera, sharks? What about mushrooms? The fungi and all that. Are there cultural benefits to other species than the ones that we see day to day? What do you folks think about the breadth of cultural diversity and how it spreads across the enormous diversity of life on Earth? Anyone want to take that up?
I think we're all too polite to jump in.
Well, we could put Scott on the spot because he's the one who was standing up strong for cultural diversity, and I was shot down on it.
So would you restate the question for me? Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a lot of diversity out there. I mean, does cultural diversity cut across all of it, or is it just for birds, plants, dragonflies, the ones we've been talking about?
No, I certainly
the fungi.
Well, I think certain members of certain cultures certainly do. So I would agree that that cultural diversity sort of underlies the value of biodiversity.
That's interesting because have you heard this term biocultural diversity? Any of you? So there are many ways of measuring diversity. The Shannon Index, the Sims. We have all these technical terms, numbers of species or species versus. And some people have been arguing you need what's called biocultural diversity, and it is the diversity that the culture in the area sees, right? And that's often very different from the scientific quantification of diversity. And they feel that it's almost before you start working, managing, you need to know what the biocultural diversity is. Any thoughts on that? I mean, does biocultural diversity come into park management, for example, Clara?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot of what I was getting at earlier. Is being New York City, there's a huge diversity of people and interests residing here, and I'm not an expert in mushrooms or other fungi, but I know there is a large group of those experts here in New York City. And despite it being a very urban place, there are people who forage for mushrooms in New York City. So I think cultural, themes and cultural diversity run through all levels of biodiversity, not just the charismatic plants, the beautiful wildflowers, but also, the chicken of the woods, the hen of the woods, the morels, they're there in New York City, despite the super urban environment. So that's definitely something we think about. We also have mountain bikers who want to come through the trails on their mountain bikes and aren't necessarily looking at the diversity of plants or birds that are there, but they're looking for the diversity of jumps or events that they can have while they're in the park. So we have a lot to consider in terms of management and diversity of management actions.
All right. Well,
even the lowly the lowly cicada, which is out right now. I've had many people writing me, Shahid, just even the last week, saying they really couldn't wait to taste some cicadas. When were they going to find cicadas in Brooklyn? When were they going to find cicadas in Long Island so that they'll be able to consume them as food? And I think those are things we have to consider. Of course, unfortunately, they don't seem to be, large emergencies of those in those areas. But, insects, are more part of our lives than just mere pests. There are the beautiful insects, there are pest insects, but then there are these ones in between that we might value for some protein source or for some other reason, other than just beauty, or kind of detesting them for being pest insects.
Wow, yeah, actually, Stephen Vondrak asked about the periodic cicadas, and we talked about them earlier being sort of a national phenomenon, even though they're mostly here in the East. Yeah, so it's really, I didn't know that people were dying to eat them. Well, they better they won't be able to do it for another 17 years, so I suppose they better stack up on it. Michelle Smith asks an interesting question, which it's interesting to me because we actually have a place not far from Black Rock, and she says that if mayapple is the most common species in New York City, how come we don't see it very much in the wild up here in the highlands? And the same with columbine. So maybe Clara, you might have an answer to that. The reason I think that's interesting is because actually maybe it's just this year, but we have a lot of mayapple and a lot of columbine this year in our small little place. So maybe it's something that fluctuates. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason we saw so many observations of that species in New York City is because it is cultivated, even though it's cultivated with native plants. They are planting things in large patches in areas where they'd be seen. Also, the time of year, this is when mayapple blooms. It's going to slowly disappear, and something else will take its place in that garden. In the natural areas of New York City, we actually don't have, it's not as common as it is in Central Park. So probably fall more along the lines of what you're seeing in the Hudson Highlands. But I would also add that citywide, I'm seeing more and more spring ephemerals this year, or those sort of early blooming spring plants than I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years. And I don't have any real evidence for this, but my running theory is that the snow pack that we had this year, we had several really good snows for the first time in 4 or 5 years, really helped the spring ephemerals take off and sort of has increased the number and the size of the population that germinated this year. So that might be why you're seeing more Shahid. It might be why they were so successful coming up in Central Park this year. So no certainties, but that's my running theory.
Well, I think one of the really important and powerful things about species is that their numbers fluctuate over time. And like the 17-year cicada, of course, is an extreme example of that. It actually turns out in biodiversity research that variability from year to year, that some years you have lots of one kind of species, and the next year you have other species which are more abundant. It's actually what keeps nature stable. And there's both mathematical and empirical data for that. So on the other hand, it can be disappointing if you want to go and find a mayapple and you just can't find it that year because it's not a good year for it. So Pam Bremen asks a question, and I think about this. I actually grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I didn't hear very much about nature, which is probably why my parents wanted to be a medical doctor. And I feel that the parks actually do get quite a different amount of attention and also different levels of connection with the local communities. Any ideas about what ways we could serve to engage the community in a park that has been underserved? That's Pam Bremen's question. I often think that when we bring people to Black Rock Forest and they go back home, that to the city, that will help them look at their green spaces differently. But any thoughts about the heterogeneity in the way the parks are served or serve people?
Well, I know that our stewardship division works really hard to do outreach throughout the city to get people out. A lot of it is invasive species pulls as sort of an introductory way to get people into the parks. And I know our recent commissioner has put forth some really successful efforts in trying to anchor parks in neighborhoods that were not as well served in the past, improve the access to those parks. So those are some things that are ongoing. Unfortunately, in New York City, because it's almost all developed, it's hard to create new parks in areas, right? We're sort of stuck with improving the parks and the parklands that we have. And in a lot of the really developed areas, those are more along the lines of playgrounds and lawns than they are natural areas. Those are harder to keep in the middle of Brooklyn or Queens. So that's certainly an issue that is harder to solve.
Yeah, you know, I think it's true out here as well. So much of the land is now private or housing developments, or it's very hard to find new spaces. Although you have things like taking abandoned rail lines, or like the High Line, and actually finding new ways to create green spaces, which are not the same as park, but they still do that. So we have more questions. Of course, this could go on for a long time, but and I would encourage those of you who have questions to do contact us. You can find our emails. We'd be happy to share with you your thoughts and our thoughts about biodiversity and its significance. So I'd like to thank you all. Thank again the organizers and of course our panel of experts here. What I'd like to do is to turn it over by presenting some closing comments from our board co-chairs, David Redden and Hume Steyer. David Redden actually provided some really nice, well-crafted comments for closing. So I'll read those to you. And what he says is, you know, I want to acknowledge a profound debt to Bill Golden and his daughter Sybil. Bill's life goal was to benefit science in an abundance of ways, such as being chair of the American Museum of Natural History. He saw the possibility of a remarkable research forest close to New York City. Bill's vision was a consortium of educational institutions of every kind and at every level to bring hands-on science to thousands of developing minds. It is still the program we live by today. Sybil became the forest's second chair and continued the Golden Foundation's generous support of the forest. Her deep commitment to Black Rock Forest was made strikingly clear by the extraordinarily generous gift she made in her will. Bill Golden saved the forest. Sybil Golden guaranteed the preservation of the forest and its mission. Bill Golden's greatest gift to the forest, apart from giving us Bill Schuster, was his vision. Sybil Golden's great gift was the assurance of our future. We salute them both and thank you for supporting Black Rock Forest.
Good evening. This is Hume Steyer, co-chair with David Redden of the Black Rock Forest Board of Trustees. Coming to you from my living room because this is a virtual benefit. I just have been asked to make some concluding remarks, and in keeping with the spirit of that request, I will keep them brief. But I do want to thank our guest speakers this evening for giving us so generously of their time and expertise. And I'd also like to thank all of you for attending, and in particular, those of you who've made a contribution to Black Rock Forest in connection with this benefit. And for those of you who haven't done it yet but would like to, we would be grateful for that too. It's easily done by either clicking on the link at the bottom of your screen, which will take you to our donations page, or by scanning the QR code also on your screen. Thank you for your support. It's been an interesting year for Black Rock Forest, but I'm happy to say we've emerged stronger and with more comprehensive and interesting and productive programs than ever before. And thank you to Bill Schuster and everyone on our outstanding staff for making that happen. And with that, I'd like to toss the microphone back to Bill and wish you all a very good night. Bye.
Well, thank you, Hume and David, for those comments, and thanks to our wonderful expert panel. It's been really interesting and engaging. And thank all of you who are attending the event tonight. I'd like to ask you to please stay tuned for a lovely brief video from Black Rock Forest that was filmed during our recent BioBlitz. And for those of you contributing at the Kingdom or Final level and your guests, those of you going to breakout rooms after, there's no need to do anything other than click on the link at the bottom of your screen. And for the rest of you, on behalf of Black Rock Forest, we give our sincere thanks to you all and wish you a wonderful rest of your evening. I'm Bill Schuster. I'm the director of Black Rock Forest. Next spring it'll be 30 years that I've been here.
I'm Hillary Callahan. I'm the president here at Black Rock Forest, and my regular job is as a professor of biology at Barnard College.
We take care of a natural area, but run an organization whose mission is to advance scientific understanding of the natural world through research, education, and conservation. I think it was the engagement of the people. You know, we had a lot of people show up today. I'm not sure how many, 40 or something like that, and they were immersed in the woods, and they were walking with experts, and they were enjoying, and they were contributing. Really thankful and happy to be part of it, and talking about coming back and contributing some more.
I'm a botanist, so I saw a lot of familiar trees, plants, shrubs, even mosses. Citizen science makes everybody more knowledgeable about science and about how broad science is.
The contributions to science are going to become even greater over time. The app that we use today, iNaturalist, for example, has been tremendously successful in allowing ordinary citizens without science backgrounds who are interested in nature to capture important information that can be verified. And you know, as many scientists as are on the world can only do so much. When you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of other people gathering data, adding to global databases, that's really powerful. We aim to keep working more with citizen scientists of all types.
One thing I think often missed is that biodiversity is knowledge, and all of the species have their own individual things they can teach us. You know, a tree can teach us a lot about sustainability. A bee can teach us a lot about sustainability and efficiency. And if we study biodiversity, we'll learn a lot more about ourselves.
Nature is our life support system, and the organisms that are out there are what helps keep us alive. Many of them are directly important to us or indirectly important to humans as well. And we don't want to waste this wonderful natural treasure that we're given. We need to retain and celebrate the diversity of life on Earth. We need to learn to live with and not destroy our natural biological diversity.